Michelle Schimmel with Real Chemistry. Absolutely pleased to be here today and to be joined by Gavin Nichols and Andy Quartz. Hello and welcome, gentlemen.
Hello.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining me today for a discussion about omnichannel experiences in pharma. Before we dive into the topic at hand, I was hoping that you both could do a brief introduction of yourselves and your companies. Gavin, so there's no awkward start. Gavin, go ahead. You jump in first.
Thank you, Michelle. Gavin Nichols, I'm CEO of Calyx. I've been involved in life sciences for just over 20 years now, mainly on the technology side, worked for a number of different organizations in discovery and in clinical development. Spent a decade at Quintiles, now IQVIA. Calyx is an e-clinical and imaging company. So we provide medical imaging to life science companies. We also provide large-scale technologies that support clinical development. Interestingly, Calyx was a spin-out, a carve-out of a CRO, and we actually did that at the start of the year. So for anyone who's thinking of a carve-out, my only advice is don't do it in the middle of a pandemic. Some interesting discussions.
Many things we should all not start in the middle of a pandemic, I think we've learned, but congratulations on your success. And Andy, over to you.
Yeah, Andy Quartz. I'm SVP of Research and Analytics at SignalPath. I joined SignalPath during the pandemic, so I think I'm part of the Great Resignation. But joined them, and core focus of the team that I manage is how can we minimize clinical trial site burden by digitizing protocols and enabling their execution on a clinical trial management system. And then from a research perspective, how can we partner with pharma companies to leverage the site network that SignalPath has built out, namely with large hospital and physician practices. SignalPath was acquired in September of 2021 by Verily, which is an Alphabet Google company, with the idea that while they were developing a decentralized trial platform, we were developing a site platform, and the two together could begin to enable these omnichannel experiences we speak about. Prior to SignalPath, I spent the last decade as Chief Information Officer at Sarah Cannon, that is HCA's Cancer and Research Institute. And there I built both Sarah Cannon's site network and their contract research organization software platforms.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So omnichannel experiences. I thought a good way for us to begin the conversation was to define what you mean and what we mean by omnichannel and how that differs from multi-channel. Andy, do you want to start with how you consider the omnichannel experience?
Happy to start. Let's see. I think you mentioned multi-channel. I think the notion that we could connect with consumers, with patients, really happened with the advent of mobile and with the internet. And what you saw was a number of pilots, and you saw that contact centers now not only could answer the telephone, but they could also answer a chat room, or a robot could respond as well. I think what you ultimately saw there was with multi-channel was a very siloed experience as a customer, meaning if I was on the phone and somehow asking for a request and then somehow dropped the connection or had to do a follow-up and decided to go into a chat, you basically had to start all the way from square one. And what omnichannel really says is no matter what channel I engage, there is always context on the type of consumer I am and the type of request that I'm attempting to make. And so it really challenges an organization from a siloed perspective and kind of from a customer experience perspective to begin to blend all those channels together. And I think we're still in the midst of different organizations of where they are on that commitment.
Agreed. Gavin, anything to add?
Yeah, I agree with Andy in that viewpoint. I think it also creates a challenge and opportunity, because I think that omnichannel nature, as we move from that kind of multi-channel where you can control that siloed nature, where you're understanding who and how and what you're doing, to much more of a broader engagement, it puts a responsibility on us to be able to communicate in such a way that we can talk to patients and make it relevant for them, all the way up to chief scientists in different organizations. So having a lexicon and a language that's accessible by all, but also gets to the value that you're trying to convey, is a really interesting dynamic, and we're seeing that play out at the moment.
Yeah, and when we think about omni-channel experiences, it's one that should feel seamless and personalized, and to your point, relevant. And omni-channel experiences has learned about who you are and what experiences you've had. So it's like a smarter experience in some ways. A lot of people talk about how that shows up and outside of the world of healthcare. And we're going to spend the majority of our time talking about the world of healthcare. But what companies or brands do you think are doing this well outside of healthcare that you're either inspired by as as marketing professionals, as healthcare professionals, or for you yourselves as consumers and consumers of the world and brands? Who's doing it right, in your opinion? Gavin, you want to start this time? I
Yeah,
keep remembering.
sure.
I have to choose someone to start. Yes.
Yeah, and the company I'm going to suggest is Novartis, and the reason why I say that is my sense is I don't feel it's being done to me. I mean, it starts with their CEO Vash, who engages in omni-channel and multi-channel communications, but it's not about the primary message of Novartis. It's about a broader message. And then as I interact with that, I can dive into and be taken through into Novartis and what they're doing in their pipeline and how they do it. But it feels very seamless from an initial contact, which may be talking about Vas talking about he was talking about hiking with his children the other day, and it kind of got me interested, and I went further and realised that what Novartis is doing in the wider community inside Switzerland and others. So it was a really nice way of coming out. So.
That's lovely, and I'm glad that your example is actually inside the world of healthcare. Andy, what about you?
Yeah, let's see. I debated on this one because I kind of think hotels have got it easy to a certain extent because they've scaled so much. But you know, I'm not going to pick hotels because I still can't seem to get the digital key to work right until after I check in. So I still haven't had great experiences.
An extra
but I haven't
trip down
traveled
to
that
the
much.
lobby for you?
Yeah, still
Yeah.
haven't traveled that much during the pandemic. Actually, the analogy I want to make to is one my older brother is in, and he's leading a restaurant tech software company. And restaurants are kind of really similar to the provider side of healthcare, extremely fragmented, very local. But what they've been able to do, I think, if you think about restaurants, what the way they used to design the kitchen was really on who was going to show up at peak hours of the day. So some restaurants here in Nashville can get really busy on a Friday night from 7 p.m. to 11 p.m. And the whole kitchen is designed to scale to accommodate kind of that peak hour.
Sure.
And what they're seeing now a lot of is they've activated all these digital channels, namely through the growth of the pandemic. And these digital channels now have really defragmentized a lot of a restaurant experience. So you can pull up your Uber Eats on a Friday night, and the restaurants are actually kind of combating that as well, trying to become the front door for you as well. But the idea now that I can dramatically change the capacity of a restaurant by activating these digital channels and the pressure that puts on the kitchen, or potentially they go and invest in a ghost kitchen, I think is a really good analogy to what we're seeing in healthcare, meaning today we're constrained by clinical trial accrual. We're constrained by really the square footage of the cancer center that we have. And what I think is going to start to really change is the notion that this care delivery can be delivered to the home, and it can be delivered digitally, much in the same way that we've got a very local system of restaurants, but all of a sudden I can hit a button and 30 to an hour 30 later, I can have a nice plate of smoked wings in my house.
The capacity to serve is so much greater when you think about an omni-channel experience and a different experience. I love the the link that you've made between what you're seeing with restaurants and the digital channels and then healthcare. Gavin, I would ask you to do the same. So, in the Novartis example, you were talking about the personal stories and how they're using how Novartis is using Omnichannel and thus. How are you applying some of those principles to the work that you all are doing?
Yeah, and so I think one of the things I have to say about Calyx is one of the things we benefited from is launching a new brand at this time, because we were able to say, okay, let's ignore the legacy. What does a good experience look like? And so, we set out a customer, success kind of management idea that said, what's the important messages that our clients and our, the wider, stakeholders need to understand? Let's start a digital, interaction through LinkedIn and different, channels, but use data that we know about pipelines and what different, clients are working on, what they need to understand from us, how we can add value to them, and do targeted messages for them. And then when they connect back through to us, the chat, the follow up, the demo is very targeted to them. I think also, just picking up on one of Andy's points, I think one of the things that as we decentralize trials, as we go more digital, one of the things that we're opening up, and actually I think it's a responsibility on all of us, is to make it much more accessible to patients. Because I mean, if you think about the traditional way of doing things, it was, and there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Is, sponsor, to a CRO, to a site, and the site, and if that site has a relationship with a patient, then that patient may be able to get onto clinical research. Now it's a case of, well, potentially the patients can be anywhere in the world, and they should be anywhere in the world, and they can, affect their ability to find research that's pertinent to them, and potentially, and we've still got some work to do, actually engage and actually be able to be involved in clinical research. And I think that's going to radically change the way and the speed at which clinical research is done, because it's going to be down to much more personalized medicine. It's going to drive much more engagement with different diverse populations, and the delivery is going to be done through a digital medium. So it's exciting for me to see where this can take us.
It's so exciting for all of us, especially the needs we all have to accelerate clinical research and to discover and to provide more solutions to more people. So I could not agree more. One of the things you mentioned was about creating a targeted experience and targeted messaging versus just being everywhere. And for me, that's kind of one of the differences between creating omni-channel experiences and then taking a multi-channel approach. Multi-channel, we're just everywhere. It's every channel. But when we create omni-channel experiences, we've learned, and we're using data and technology, and then we're at the right places with the right message at the right time. So you both started to talk about digital channels and technology. Can you talk about that a little bit more? Gavin, how are you using data and technology to be able to achieve what you're all looking to do?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and actually, I think the data's been there for a while. I think it's about, kind of bringing all the pieces together. So, arguably, you can look at public information sources and understand what development pipelines are working on. But when you then start to fuse that against, okay, well, I have an understanding of who's responsible in that organization for doing it, and I actually have a digital signature of how to get my message to them. I can be much more targeted. And again, it's not an intrusive way. It's, kind of sometimes feels like Big Brother, but it's more about saying, I have a value and I need to be able to get it to you. And therefore, I'm going to be smart about what and who I deliver that message to. And I'd use that at digital point. But I think, as Andy mentioned, there's also an inheritance that comes with that when that individual comes back. I think with a lot of multi-channel, it's just a blind interaction. You start from there. But we're actually with omni-channel, because you inherit the metadata that comes with it, it's a much more meaningful conversation that you can have, again, through digital and through traditional means.
Love it. Andy, thoughts, builds?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think just what data and I think there's two things. The whole notion of decentralized trials is the idea that the site is not paramount for patient recruitment now. And all of a sudden, either through Google keyword searches, other means of really being able to target potential patients, you now can create a recruitment funnel that we haven't seen the likes of in the past. And so that recruitment, we think, should dramatically change in terms of the ability to offer studies to a whole variety of folks. Basically, anyone searching on the internet ideally would become eligible for studies now that we've begun to kind of decentralize them. From a data perspective, I think we're starting to finally see the walls come down around data liquidity and around fragmentation that we haven't seen in the past. Tokenization is a technology that's finally being funded in a significant way. So the ability to link data sets that were disparate in the community, whether that's data from your pharmacy or data from the physician practice or data from the hospital, that data now can begin to be linked together to really enrich the data sets that I don't think we've seen happen in the past. So the whole notion that, hey, I'm a cancer patient, I'm going on a trial, and we're going to start when I'm on my third round of chemotherapy, when I'm finally on this study, and then data stops there and it ends there, and you get the sliver of the whole patient experience. We're going to really see through tokenization and the ability to enrich those data sets. Pharma will have a much better view into kind of why something worked, why it didn't work, and a lot more signal to chase in order to accelerate the research and enable, far much more precision than we've seen in the past.
You're both talking about an even broader base from which to recruit from, that this is like kind of exploding all the folks that are out there. And I was having a conversation actually earlier today about a trial where they're having some difficulty with recruitment. And we were hypothesizing that part of it was that folks are not even yet diagnosed. And so potentially easier to target and reach people with these messages when they can, self-identify and they've been diagnosed. Do you think that kind of the technology that you're using and this expanded base from which to recruit from will be more helpful in those, kind of harder to recruit to start with trials? Andy?
Yeah, I just think back to what we were talking about a minute ago around this concept of tokenization, the local fragmentation of healthcare has really prevented data pooling in any meaningful way. Yeah. And the more that we can set loose entrepreneurs, health providers, health systems, and more that we can see these data pools come into reality, I think it's a lot easier to find patients of rare disease, to find the signal that didn't exist in the past. And, I've done a lot of work with electronic health records, mainly in cancer and clinical trial matching. And the reality was we did not have the depth that we needed in the EHR to really get the precision that we needed on the match. The data sets just did not match. And I think as we bring in more and more data sets and we have a larger pool to fish from, we can find signal in a lot different places.
Great. You go ahead, Gavin. Did you want to add on?
Well, I do want to add on it. I think it's an interesting space. I mean, as you can tell by my accent, I was born and bred outside of the US. And it's interesting to do some comparisons of our data. I mean, growing up in a country that has socialized medicine, which actually has a high level of aggregated data, but it's centralized and it's not being made ubiquitous. So the potential usage is fairly limited. I'm with Andy. I think now with the tokenization, we can, when needed, kind of aggregate a much broader view. And if we can democratize that back to the patient, I think most patients are certainly, when you look at acute or chronic, diseases, want to be empowered to take that and understand and actually be able to take a digital representation of themselves and find the right study for them. And I think, we're starting to see that come into reality. And I think, over the next 5 years, we'll see that really accelerate. I think that there's no better, patient advocate than the patient. And I think they will, if we can get this right and we can actually enable them to find the right studies and actually, get on to cutting edge treatments, then we've all done a good thing there.
Completely agree. And I'm kind of glad that you brought up that the desire of the patient to advocate for their own health and keep themselves and their loved ones, if it's a caretaker or care partner, healthy. I would be remiss, as we talk about technology, not to mention and to highlight that not every patient, every person has the same access to technology as others. And I know this is a much longer and bigger conversation, maybe than we can fully tackle right now, but I'd love your thoughts. And maybe, Gavin, we could start with you on how do we need to think about omnichannel experiences, or just what pops into mind for you and your team as you consider folks who don't have the same kind of access to technology and digital channels?
Yeah, and Misha, thank you for the question. I mean, I think it's multifaceted, multidimensional. I think there are certainly barriers. I think access. I think where you live in the world, your level of social connectivity, the demographics.
Mhm.
But I also think the diversity of different in how you take in, how you trust information when you come in. I think one of the things that we've seen, as there's been a lot of press around, the uptake of different populations for COVID vaccines, and actually in the clinical research, and actually knowing and being able to have the right information delivered in the right channel, because
Right.
a lot of it does come down to channel, and so this is where omni-channel or multi-channel needs to change and say, okay, well, actually, who do certain different parts of the community, who do they trust, and who do we have to deliver the message to?
Yeah.
I think that the border one around access to technology, I think is going to be, it's going to take more than this conversation to the next. But I think one of the responsibilities for us as technologists is to ensure that we can deliver it at not the most sophisticated, but the lowest. What is the lowest common denominator? Can
Sure.
we actually get information that can be, that can be delivered through, text? I remember the old, SMS and different things. And one of the things that we were asked to do at the start of the COVID epidemic was to actually create an app that could be used by frontline healthcare workers in third world countries, in Bangladesh and others. And one of the things we did is, yes, we created an app and the typical tablet environment, but we also created a support activity that was delivered through SMS text, and actually on a weekly basis would fire a text and get into simple yes no answers and go back. So I think there's a responsibility on us to find the lowest common denominator and to be able to live it. But
I love that example. At Real Chemistry, we have had the honor to be very involved with COVID and helping bring information and vaccines out to the world. And you hit on a lot of what we learned, and is a message and lesson for all of us as we continue to work in healthcare, which is that it's the right message and information at the right channels and through trusted advisors and influencers, the right people delivering that message. It's so important. Um, we've learned a lot in COVID. Not and you and I have just spoken about a little of it. Andy, what have you all been kind of taking away from the learnings from the COVID pandemic and applying to your business today?
Yeah, I think just in terms of the industry in general, I think what we thought of when we thought of omni-channel or we thought of telehealth, I think pre-COVID, it was always kind of a neat pilot
Mm-hmm.
that kind of the innovation officers would promote. And the amount of capital that was laid out there to successfully execute a pilot, usually more or less always had successes, but it also had these kind of gotchas of, hey, we're not really scaling yet, and we're kind of still in the experimentation mode. We're not yet figuring out how to commercialize this. And I think the world has fundamentally changed in that we now have seen dramatic amount of capital chasing after these decentralized trial space. It could either be that there's too much money sloshing around in the post-COVID world, or that actually these technologies are now in the scaling mode, and that they're actually more than just a novel idea, and then it's actually going to become a very common way of how we do business.
Yeah.
And just in terms of a lot of it is timing as well. If you think about the watch that I wear, enabling wearables, enabling a mobile platform now that I think is pretty much ubiquitous across at least the US, is now you can really, the breadth and depth of research that's going to be becoming, because we're no longer kind of have this governor of a physician practice, and now we have this ability to deliver this in a much more digitally scaled model, I think is going to dramatically change the success of research after COVID.
As you're talking, this kind of headline is ringing in my head, which is from neat pilot to necessity.
Very true.
We have really, things change when it becomes neat to very much needed, and there's a lot of lessons we all can take from that I think are here for to stay, if you will.
Yeah, I mean it's a lot for pharma to change the way it does business, but actually you're seeing now that it's beyond pilot, it's beyond experimentation. It's like we must scale, and once kind of these organizations realize that they need to scale, the battleship can actually move, and you'll see tremendous progress really quickly.
We can do it, and we can do it quickly. We have learned a lot. I think we're getting close to wrap, and so I was just going to ask you all one more question, which is, we talk a lot about right now about clinical trials and pre-commercial experiences. How do we start to connect what you all are doing and what you're learning and how you're engaging with patient communities to kind of other stakeholders in the healthcare ecosystem and maybe even into the commercial model? Like right now, it feels like these omnichannel experiences are amazing, but still fragmented. Do you see a world where they might better connect? Gavin, you want to start?
Yeah, I do. I think one of the things that we're going to have to think about is as we collapse some of that fragmentation, how we inherit information and keep on moving it forward.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, clinical research, and for good reason, isn't actually becoming any more simplified. It's actually more complex because we're getting to the harder diseases. We're getting into the orphan and the rare diseases, and
Sure.
the next oncological candidate. I think, though, very similar to what Annie was talking about the tokenization of patient information. I think we're going to start to see that in a therapy point of view, so that information that's learned about a potential therapy at the preclinical stage, the animal study, now goes forward into into the research stage, and then actually the things that we learn about different patient responses goes forward into commercialization. I think a really great example of this was actually the COVID-19 vaccine.
Yeah.
I mean, you've heard it was rushed, but it wasn't rushed. That base science had been around 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
And that information was inherited upon, and actually we've got to get better at being able to deliver that out to the consumer so they understand that actually there's a lot of rigor and a lot of science that sits behind these.
Totally agree. We do a lot. We can certainly do that for sure. Andy, last words from you. Anything you'd like to add?
I'll just say this August I got a breakthrough case of COVID, and I figured probably the best thing for me to do was to look up any clinical trials that could be available to me. So literally on day 2 of the disease, I enrolled in a clinical trial, Active 6, and had a great omnichannel experience. So it was all digital for the enrollment. All of a sudden, 2 days later, a FedEx package arrived. It was the experimental drug, fluvoxamine, which I took, and they actually have gotten great results out of in Brazil. And to me, it just proved that we can democratize access to clinical trials, and digital is the way forward.
It's amazing what happens when we become that N of one and our worlds collide. But I think that makes it better experiences for everyone. And thank you both for the work that you're doing. And thank you so much for the time that you've taken with us today. And thank you everyone else for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.